A lot of people, when you attend conferences, talk about procurement having a seat at the table. For me, that's not a phrase that I ever use because ultimately procurement I don't even know if it's an imaginary table or an imaginary seat, because I really, in business, you get what you deserve and get what, you have credibility for delivering for the business. We notoriously in the past have tended to take an incremental approach to technology investment. Whereas actually right now, there's a great opportunity to actually leapfrog forward rather than just go in an incremental gain.
Hello, welcome to Proc-N-Roll. Today we're sitting down with John Dickson. John has spent 40 years in procurement, leading large global teams as a senior procurement leader and chief procurement officer across some of the names you'd recognize instantly: GSK, Diageo, Heinz, Rolls-Royce, British Petroleum, Network Rail, and most recently AstraZeneca, where he served as CPO through the pandemic years. He's now taking selected advisory work. Few people in procurement have had his vantage. He's led procurement through the financial crisis, through COVID, and now the AI inflection point. And today we're going to be talking about all that. And John, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time. You've called this moment an inflection point. There's cost, risk, sustainability, geopolitics. People are dealing with all the issues there. And then you've got technology and AI. All of it's moving at once. So across your 40 years, you've also lived through the financial crisis and COVID and many other kind of shifts. Is this moment today any different, and why?
Well, I think it is different. Firstly, I appreciate the time to spend with you guys having a chat about my favorite subject. I think we certainly are at an inflection point from a procurement point of view. I see where we are today very much as a perfect storm. So we've got all those kind of things combining and converging at the same time, as you've just outlined, Zach. Whereas all the other elements of Y2K and the financial crisis was very much a specific challenge at the time. I think also what we see is the rapidity, the speed at which things change and come on the table of a CPO or a senior procurement leader. It's much more rapid now. And the expectation and the credibility of the procurement function is also changing, which I think is for the better. AI is bringing opportunity for the procurement function if managed in an appropriate way. So the reason I call it an inflection is if we continue to do the things that we've done over the last 30, 40 years, and procurement's had a tremendous evolution over the last 30, 40 years, but if we continue to do things as we have to get us to where we are today, I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be right for taking us forward. There are so many opportunities, as I see it, rather than just challenges. And I think as a senior procurement professional, I would like to see the function grasp the mettle and opportunity to take the function to a different level.
Wouldn't we all, John? I mean, this has been a recurring theme, certainly in my much shorter career in procurement so far. Procurement trying to find, how it can be more strategic. You hear a lot of people talking about seat at the table, whether or not that's even relevant to the discussion. But what is it? What are those opportunities that you see? How do you see procurement actually evolving, and what can actually make the most?
I think you've just highlighted one of the challenges I personally have. A lot of people, when you attend conferences, talk about procurement having a seat at the table. For me, that's not a phrase that I ever use because ultimately procurement I don't even know if it's an imaginary table or an imaginary seat because I really, in business, you get what you deserve and get what, you have credibility for delivering for the business. And, I often talk about the story where I was on a flight with a lady CFO and I was asking her the question, why is it that procurement don't sit at the executive board level across all companies? And she said, well, when procurement come to talk about procurement, they're very good at talking about procurement, but the holistic business awareness and insight is something that procurement don't necessarily have the breadth or the depth to contribute to and add value to. And, I think rather than us spend a lot of time looking inwardly within the function and saying what we are, it's only when the business justify that statement or support that statement, is that true? So we can claim that we are a strategic function, that we're more than a service function, but ultimately it's down to the business to really decide that, not ourselves. So I think, at a time now where we have that kind of triangle of cost, resilience, and sustainability to challenge from a procurement perspective, and getting the balance of those 3 points of a triangle, it is a challenge. It's very difficult, because the raison d'etre, if you like, for a procurement function has always been cost savings, and probably always will be as the fundamental. But in an age where risk and resilience is more to the fore, ultimately you can get the best deal in the world, but if you can't get the product or the service, then it really is immaterial, the negotiated deal that you've actually achieved. And in terms of sustainability, sustainability is certainly a longer term vision and value creator than cost. The way we measure procurement tends to be a 12-month year-over-year kind of measure. And the metric for procurement has to be much longer in duration and much more value-driven than just cost as a single dimension.
John, I want to dive a little bit into what you were talking about with the CFO. Is your observation that procurement leaders struggle to be seen as strategic business leaders because of how we show up? And we're always talking about basically procurement stuff. I mean, have we been pigeonholed there unfairly, or are we putting ourselves in the pigeonhole and just with a little bit more leadership and communication and, I don't know, organization and enterprise focus, we can change all that fairly easily?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Conrad. For me, and a lot of what I talk about today is my personal opinion. Other people may have a different opinion, and that's absolutely fine. I think procurement tends to get very defensive around the conversations that we have with elements of the business. And when it comes to the 12-month cycle of budget reviews, it tends to be pretty much focused on that cost reduction. And there are broader elements of value that procurement need to bring to the table. And there's a constant education of the business as to what procurement is, but also what procurement is not. And I think often, you see procurement leaders, and I've had it myself. So I've clashed with CFOs in the past in terms of the definition of value, when all they want to talk about is hard cost savings or cost savings that they can identify in the P&L at the end of the year, where ultimately the control of whether that saving lands in the P&L is often down to the business in terms of how they use the value created by procurement by either kind of plugging gaps in their budget or investing in additional programs, etc. So, we're almost like caught in our own kind of challenges of self-preservation and kind of being much more tactical rather than elevating ourselves into a strategic conversation, and also talking about things and value that the organization don't identify themselves. And I think the future has to be how you use data, how you analyze and bring insight to data, to bring some insight to the organization that they didn't have themselves. And I think that's where you really start to differentiate the procurement delivery of value to the organization.
Zach, let me just dig in just a little bit more on this one, because we've talked in a number of podcasts about this savings versus value consideration. And I think you're right. Ourselves and other people will constantly look to us as kind of savings. But I also see that that there's a real struggle to figure out what is the metric, or how do we talk about that value. I mean, because it's just hard. I think it's really easy to fall back to, look, we saved $100 million. And it's harder to get to, look, we embedded ourselves in the business. We understood the business success criteria, and we contributed to getting that marketing rebranding or that engineering transformation. Like, we were elbow in elbow with the teams, and it's really kind of hard to metric that, or, put it into a KPI. Have you found any good ways to add another KPI alongside that can sort of start taking some of the spotlight off of that cost savings?
Yeah, I think it's probably complementary to what you've just said. What I've always tried to do is establish the rules of the game with finance in particular, but also with the business, because the business should be the ones that sign off whether that value has been brought to the table by the procurement function. But unless you have a clearly defined definition of what value is made up of, and that's agreed and worked with collectively with finance, then you constantly fight this battle every year as to what's real and what's not. And, I'm not saying that I found the holy grail in that respect, because I was still having conversations with finance people up to the end of my career as to, oh, well, that's not real. I don't see it in a P&L. I think there's a significant difference between direct materials, because you have your standard cost measurement system, which has a lot of finance elements to it. And therefore you have that strong partnership with the finance folks in terms of defining direct materials and the relationship with purchase price variance, etc. In terms of indirects, it's a whole new ball game, because a lot of it's budget driven. A lot of it's down to the eye of the beholder, the budget holder themselves, in terms of whether they know what they should be spending for a particular item which is in their specialist area. You may not necessarily have bought that item or that good or service previously. So where's your baseline? So what I've often done with my teams is really go that extra mile to define the rules around baselining. So if you're comparing a product or a service from one year to the next, it's relatively straightforward. But when you've got a new item, ultimately the question is, what is the business willing to pay for that particular service, let's say? Now, if you manage to and they offset part of their budget to actually be prepared to pay for that service at that level, then you have that kind of baseline in the sand from which you can then measure. Now, what they do with any saving or value created, that's up to the business, because it's their budget. But actually, it reinforces the need for a relationship between the business and finance. And all too often, it's procurement that have to answer the question, well, where did the money go? And it's not procurement's budget. So you have this constant tug of war between the elements in the business as to who owns the accountability for the value that's created in the first place, but also how it's used. And then my last point on this subject would be, I've grown up through some serious organizations who've taken procurement very seriously. And one constant theme has been this kind of triangle, the Maslow's hierarchy of need, if you like. Now, if you think about the three tiers at the bottom of that hierarchy of need, it's assurance of supply, it's quality, and it's service. So they are the prerequisites for doing business with the company that I'm CPO of. And then you get into the differentiators of cost and innovation, which then allows a supplier to differentiate themselves from their competition. So it's ironic that we position ourselves as a procurement function who have that as our kind of hierarchy of need, yet in the key three elements at the base of that pyramid, there's nothing about cost. So the question is, are we being measured on the right thing? And I think sometimes the balance isn't quite right.
Well, I think there's so much to unpack there, John. So one thought I had is, take finance and working with finance to establish a baseline for cost savings. My experience, that's been a huge resource commitment, either on finance side or procurement side, to actually design those baselines, those methodologies, and then actually track and measure and manage and report them. Is that worthwhile to do in your view? Just a quick one from you on that one would be good.
I don't think it is that significant a resource of time. Whenever ultimately you've got four distinct elements of how you baseline, you've either bought it before or you haven't. It's a budget related item, or it's brand new. You've never ever bought it before, the business. It's a similar product, but it's not necessarily the same product. So the specification may be slightly different from one year to the next. If you can kind of work around those baselines, I don't think we're talking about baselines that are 100 long. The simpler you can make it, then the easier it is for you to kind of come to an agreement with finance that these are the rules of the game. And what you're trying to do is avoid, there's more resource intensity goes into arguing what's real and what's not than defining a baseline at the start of the process.
It's definitely easy, Zach, to overcomplicate it. I've been in these conversations. I love what John's saying. Keep it simple, like the basic rules of the game don't have to be overcomplicated. And as they do, by the way, I've talked about creativity in the past where people can get really creative in trying to game the system. And I think the simpler it is, the harder it is to hide their creativity behind the 12 dimensions that are out there.
Yeah. And I think, we constantly spin around this, dancing around whether cost avoidance counts or not. It's not a real saving because it's cost avoidance. Well, if you look at, a procurement professional buying capital equipment, their whole life tends to be around cost avoidance. So if I'm trying to motivate people who work in the capital category in my procurement organization, if I started to tell them what they do doesn't matter, then I'm not sure that would be the most motivational talk I could give them. So, I think cost avoidance has a place. And CPOs shouldn't be trying to make the number as big as possible. Actually, just the opposite. Because if you think about the direct materials, the bigger the number on price variance, the less control you have on your strategic kind of cost outlook or the pricing outlook that you have with your supply base. So, it's not about making the number bigger, but it's making sure that value and all, if you negotiate a deal and you get two for the price of one and it's not waste, then, there's value in that. If you negotiate something that drives a $300,000 saving for a part of the business and they reinvest $300,000 elsewhere, you may not see that at the end of the year in your P&L, but you can't tell me that $300,000 isn't value created for the organization. It is.
Yeah, and it shows up in finance KPIs, like in terms of the return on investment, how efficient their capital allocation is, etc. This has been such a great framework for working with finance. Thanks, John. I want to move on a little bit. I want to talk about, I think you touched on it earlier, procurement's future and where that lies. You've said procurement's future lies in deeper integration, shared purpose, and the ability to translate intelligence into decisions that matter. So can you tell us a little bit more what exactly you mean by that?
At the root of that is moving away from the conversations that we've just hypothesized on. The fact that there's so much data in the organizations that we work for, but it's how do you drive insights from that data to become much more strategic and have a relationship which is at that strategic level rather than at the transactional level. So we've evolved as a function to almost like being, masters of source to contract in some places, masters of source to pay in some. And, if you think about the future technologies, they will have a significant impact on those elements of that facet of procurement activity. So therefore, the question would be, well, where will procurement earn its corn moving forward. And it has to be in, being much more strategic, it being much more of an ecosystem manager, be it both internal and external ecosystems. So how do you drive much more insight and creativity and innovation from those ecosystems? And for me, the number one ecosystem will be your internal business relationships. And we've got to get away from, trying to justify why we exist and what we do, to being a true partner in business. We've all had, business partnership initiatives in procurement. And often that's been somebody sitting having a cup of coffee with somebody, and that's classed as business relationship, business stakeholder management. That's not what I'm talking about. When I was back in my SmithKline Beecham days, I was asked to be head of research and development procurement, and all we bought were test tubes. There was nothing else that we were involved in, no clinical research studies, nothing. And so I employed half of my team were chemists, because I felt it was easier for me to take a chemist and turn them into a procurement professional than take somebody who was a procurement professional and make them a chemist literate individual. So that blend of chemist and procurement professional worked really, really well. And it wasn't long before we were involved in clinical studies and central labs and all these kind of things, key opinion leaders, investigator grants, etc., that we were not involved in previously. But it was because we offered a blended solution of capability to the business. And it was very strongly received by the then R&D organization at SmithKline Beecham.
Did you bring those people out of the business or from outside, or a blend of both?
A bit of both, but mostly from inside the business, because, the desire to try something new was there. So people really wanted to investigate an opportunity to try a different function. Many people were intrigued as to what procurement stood for. They probably thought that because they procured in their personal life, they could probably do it in a professional sense as well, but it's all very different, as we know. So it was a blend of internal, but mostly from the internal teams.
So, that's a great takeaway.
Super powerful to get that credibility, right? You can speak their language.
Yeah.
No, that's so many of the conversations we've had here on the podcast are kind of coming up in flavors of what you're describing. I think it's fantastic that kind of leadership to go from test tubes to like deeply involved in what matters in the business. At a leadership level, did this just kind of ease into the business, or do you have can you think back to a moment when you sat back with the leadership team and said, look, this is how we can help you. And I'm not here to, buy test tubes for less money. I'm here to help you achieve your broader goals. And, let's figure out what that can look like.
I remember the pivotal moment very well. I was with Tashi Yamada, who was chairman of R&D at SmithKline Beecham. So this was before the merger in 2001 with GSK, with Glaxo, and we had a conversation. It's the first time I'd met him. We were talking about the principles of procurement and, the kind of value that I thought we were missing out on. We talked at length about how R&D folks use their budgets. They tend to be the ones in the R&D, in the pharma industry, that have deep pockets. They are champions and engine drivers of the organization. So the organization depends on them to develop new product. So they often have a fairly laissez-faire approach to spending money. But there was so much opportunity. We'd done research in terms of, there was a $20 million budget for a study, and, somebody had told the supplier, the contract research organization, what the budget was. And lo and behold, it was about $5 short of $20 million. So, I just asked for an opportunity for us to prove ourselves. And he allowed us to do that, and we saved a significant amount of money on on that very project. Now, what you can't afford to do is put some of these studies at risk. You can't put the patient at risk. So there's a balance as well. It's not just about driving cost all the time.
And I want to extend that a little bit, John. So, the Maslow hierarchy for procurement, I think, is a great way to think about it and represents it. As you're moving up that, what is the best way to build those relationships across the business? You worked in huge businesses with so many stakeholders. How do you decide where to prioritize your efforts? Where to invest the time, etc.
Well, often it comes from the top, from a strategic outlook. So the way you build your value proposition for the business is very important. And in order for you to build a value proposition, it has to link to the business aims and objectives. Because if procurement's value proposition is on a totally different channel to the way the business is moving, then you'll never meet at a sensible point. So really overlaying that hierarchy of need, if that had no relationship to the way the business operated, then it would be a waste. So that interrelationship between, procurement's proposition to the business, there has to be, it has to be linked to a common goal, if you like.
And so how does that work just in practice? If you had to bring your team together and you say, hey, we want to become a more strategic procurement function, what would you cover in that meeting? What would the agenda be? What would you actually, how would you
demonstrating a knowledge of the business is critical, because it's about building mutual respect. Every relationship should be born out of mutual respect. If one believes that they are more entitled or higher up the hierarchy, then often that mutual respect doesn't necessarily set you off on a good path. But the way you get mutual respect is to be interested in the other party, and really understand what their needs are. There's a huge conversation between needs and wants, and the differential between that when you talk to internal stakeholders, but really getting to what is needed for them to be successful in their job is a key part. But also how you sell the procurement organization is very important. So, in the roles I've had with my leadership teams, we've always tried to arm the people in the procurement function when they actually go and sit with the internal stakeholders, that the value proposition is available on one sheet of paper, so it's relatively easy to digest and therefore relatively easy to put across. And it reinforces some of the points we've made already on this podcast around really getting in the minds of the business, understanding their business breadth and depth, and really trying to seek what's important for them to be successful. Now, again, coming back to when you sit with some very high-powered scientists in the pharmaceutical world, without a doubt, they're all interested in the patient. So AstraZeneca's ethos was, we are a very patient-centric organization. So that it sounds quite easy as a throwaway comment, but when you think about a procurement conversation starting with one of those scientists, talk about the patient, talk about, well, what is it that makes the patient important to that scientist? So it's really about relationships and being human in many respects.
Maybe this is too encompassing of a question, but I'm guessing that maybe you had this epiphany moment at some time in the last 30 or 40 years as well. But I remember early in my procurement career thinking about the purpose of procurement being these self-proclaimed goals to save that $100 million, or for my category hit 15% savings or whatever it was. And I had a moment where my thinking transferred to, I really only exist to enable the business to be successful. And maybe that is cost in some dimension for some of them, but probably it's a whole bunch of other stuff. And that kind of put me on a completely different leadership, like personal leadership and organizational leadership path. And by the way, you're talking about all of this, I believe you probably went through that. Like what triggered that, and how have you triggered that same, I think it relates to this. How have you triggered that same understanding in your people? You mean, maybe tie it together, because it is nice. I mean, I didn't have a CPO that, did the things that you're talking about, that was like, hey, it isn't about us, it's about them. And that's why I kind of arrived at that through, just different suggestions hitting me. But what happened in your case?
Well, I've been fortunate to work for some brilliant organizations. I've worked for some first-class procurement CPOs myself. So I was given an opportunity by them to elevate up the ladder relatively quickly, but I watched and I learned and I listened and I asked questions and did what anybody should do if they really want to learn their craft. And I've had, over the period of 40 years, I've had so many people try and move me out of procurement into different aspects of the business. And I kind of resisted that, because I always felt there was more that procurement could do. And in that is part of the reason that I love it, because it's got variety, it's got challenge, it's got excitement. And I just felt comfortable in that space. And, it was almost like constantly trying to crack a secret code. And I'm not suggesting for one second that I got to that kind of fulfillment, but, I had a very blessed career in procurement. And a lot of it was not just the CPOs I worked for, but I've worked for some awesome teams. And I've inherited procurement teams from previous CPOs, and the base from that allowed me to then build from there. So, it's I'm not sure if I woke up with an epiphany any particular time, but I think it was a constant by osmosis. So I was like surrounded by brilliant people at my peer level, but also above me. And some of the businesses I've worked with, in fact, pretty much all of the businesses I've worked with had some superior talent at the senior table that were approachable, that would listen, that would allow me space and time to talk about procurement's value proposition, if you like. And so they were very supportive as well. So I was very, very lucky, I think, in my career.
I want to stay on this topic because it's actually, I think it's where a lot of the values coming across, John. Like, how do you do that with the rest of your team? So I think you had one suggestion was to, take a chemist and turn them into a procurement person. That's super practical, great way to build that kind of foundation that you need. If you're already in a big procurement organization, and I see this a lot as well, where the people are disconnected from the actual front line, if you like, and especially in the indirect side of things, right? How do you build that interest? How do you encourage your team, your people, to actually go out there and learn and understand the business more? Is there something practical you do there, or you just task them to?
The fact that we have one of our major tools in procurement is the category strategy. That's the best vehicle for anybody to learn their organizations now, or learn their organizations beyond just the conceptual understanding of that category, because you can't write a category strategy in isolation of the business. So if I wrote a category strategy in this room here without really engaging with the stakeholder or the internal person that required that category, then I can guarantee when I took it to them, they would tell me that, well, you haven't engaged me in it. You haven't really hit the nail on the head because you missed all these points that are valid. So, that's a tremendous vehicle to kind of bridge the gap between a procurement professional and their internal stakeholder. Now, if you're talking about, what's interesting, when you're talking about travel and airline flights, that's a very emotional category. And if you've got an organization of 100,000 people, half of those are probably flying across the world. You can't get out and talk to 50,000 people, and you certainly can't satisfy 50,000 people's needs. So you need to kind of elevate that conversation to what is the policy of the organization to get the best value and look after their staff appropriately. So, you can apply a category strategy creation in many, many different ways to kind of build up that knowledge of the business.
Did you?
That's awesome.
Sorry, Zach.
That's such a great.
I love this practical question, right? So they are assigned to build a category strategy. Did you have them report it back to you and the senior leadership on the other side, or like how did you test from your side? How did you test that it was happening with that kind of collaboration?
The category strategy needed to be signed off by a key stakeholder. So there needed to be a key stakeholder representative who would sign off that category strategy. And throughout the course of the evolution, you don't because some category strategies take 6 months to do, some take 2 weeks to do. So the 6 month ones tend to be complex, tend to be strategic or critical in nature. So giving opportunity for the category manager to bring that to the collective procurement leadership team, I think is a very good thing to do. And we followed more recently the Amazon theory of the 2 or 4 pager. If you can't articulate your strategy in a 2 or 4 pager, then it probably isn't the right strategy. So we didn't want to. So we had people bring a 2 or a 4 page synopsis of their strategy to the PLT. We reviewed it in real time, so that we were asking one person would ask the right question, if you like, and then you don't get repetitive questions of the same question. So that seemed to go down very well. It allowed us to help and guide, and sometimes the category manager knows much more than the PLT. So there's a quid pro quo there in terms of how much you guide and how much you get in the way. Sometimes getting out of the way is a pretty good leadership style.
Signing,
that's a great.
Like there was an ink process, or there's just a validation from the PLT that says, who did you, like this is the team on the business that we did this with, and they're aligned, or they're in there presenting alongside your category leader.
All of the above. I mean, without being too prescriptive, because you don't want it to grind to a halt. If they wanted to get a signature on a page and demonstrate that in the presentation, then fine. If they wanted to bring the supporter from the business alongside, even better. That would cement it significantly. But there are category management platforms now which are very AI driven, which enable you to write your strategy, and as you're writing it, you invite stakeholders in to kind of contribute live, if you like. So there's very little excuse really now for other than nervousness and maybe a bit of fear of the stakeholder. There's no excuse for you not to engage with your stakeholders as you craft a category strategy.
Sorry, Zach, I'll quit interrupting you. I'll quit interrupting you now. Go for it.
No, I think it's been excellent. Like, this is exactly the kind of practical insight that a lot of listeners are gonna take away and actually make actionable. But yeah, I do want to move on to AI and technology. John, you have a wealth of experience in that space, right? You've implemented source to pay across huge organizations. You've seen the trajectory of how procurement technology has evolved. And obviously now with the advent of AI, there's a whole new suite of vendors and applications that are coming on. And fundamentally, the capability is completely different. It's very transformative. It's, you've got intelligence in a way, that you can deploy. What's your view on AI and its impact on procurement? Do you think it's going to be a boon for procurement? Do you think there's a risk for procurement, or is it both? Maybe.
I think there are pluses and minuses, I think. If I think about the challenge that procurement decision makers face right now, the landscape of technology for procurement related processes is saturated. It seems, we tend to revel in the fact that we can show a spider map of 1,000 platforms that will bring a solution to procurement. The problem is, if you don't know what you're solving for, you don't know what you're buying. And I think all too often we get a little bit carried away with, the more options, the better. Now, the downside of that is, unless you know the technology, unless you know what it is that you're trying to solve for, then there's a danger that you will invest in the wrong platform and it won't deliver what you want it to deliver. And CFOs tend to hold the purse strings on digital investment. So you have to put a business case together. Business cases for procurement process are notoriously difficult to show return on investment. Now, there are ways around it, but it's complicated. And if you fail, and the chances are you'll be at the back of the queue, a very long queue, which is outside the CFO officer's door, from other functions wanting to have investment in digital platforms that are probably more easy to justify from a return on investment point of view. So you've got to be really spot on in terms of what that technology is. There's a lot of startups. What's your attitude to risk in terms of using a startup rather than somebody who's established, like a Microsoft or a Cooper or a SAP? So there are some brilliant solutions coming through, but I think you need to be very, very wary of what it is that you're trying to kind of solve for. And also that core understanding of leadership. Leadership must not abdicate understanding of technology to those below them. They need to work collectively as a team. But if you don't understand what it is that you're standing in front of the CFO asking for, then I'm not sure you're going to be the best ambassador for your teams, and I'd be surprised if you actually get the money you needed. So there's that. The second thing is we notoriously in the past have tended to take an incremental approach to technology investment, whereas actually right now there's a great opportunity to actually leapfrog forward rather than just go in an incremental gain. And the reason I say that is that has to be coupled with a strategy for your procurement operating model, for your vision of the function, what it is that you're trying to drive. For instance, data analytics. Data shouldn't be descriptive or definitive about what you've done in the past. It should be predictive and it should be prescriptive. So how do you use data and bring insights to an organization that predicts and prescribes how the future can be? Now, that's very difficult when you talk about the first question we talked about, which was this kind of perfect storm. It's very difficult in a VUCA world to really predict and prescribe. But I think they are going to be the game changers, those platforms that allow you to take a whole host of data, of which we have a lot, and really bring true insight about market intelligence and how things need to be shaped, rather than just accept what's there today. So I think, this is just part of this inflection point as well. Technology is going to change the shape of procurement. It'll change the size of procurement. It won't remove procurement. But if you think about some of the processes we engage in, a lot of source to pay end to end is resource intensive. It's highly transactional, highly manual in many respects. And technology will concertina that process much more favorably and remove that kind of resource burden. And we shouldn't fight that, because that's progress. What we need to be doing is to be able to define what the next generation or the next phase of evolution is from procurement, and become much more of an organization which looks at the higher level of the organization, not in the weeds, if you like.
Do you use that to make the bit? Sorry, go on, Connor.
No, sorry, Zach. We're so interested in what you're describing for a lot of reasons here, but you're talking about the leader having a deep understanding of the technology, which I 100% agree with. I mean, not only are they making a decision that could put their in the back of the row to the line to the CFO, it could either elevate their career or it could destroy their career, their reputation, the organization. Yet at the same time, AI, and let's just AI as a current driver, but the acceleration of technology and change is happening so quickly. And there's also limitations in the organizations about what you can actually do in some of these spaces. I would say maybe the top 10% of CPOs even have a clue about what these agents are capable of now. That is a tall order for them to figure that out. I mean, Zach and I are actually doing a workshop in a couple of weeks in London, inviting CPOs to come in and get hands-on agents, outside of their corporate, boundary conditions, so they can have this learning environment. But those are few and far between opportunities for the CPO and their leadership team to really understand how can they do that?
Yeah, I think it's discretionary learning. Discretionary learning for me is you going outside the boundaries of your normal day job. Once you finish your day, whenever it is, you have the opportunity to learn. You can even carve out time in your day to learn. There are enough papers written about AI and agentic and machine learning. You can learn. There are courses available to you. I'm sure that you can justify a case within your organization to be financed through a learning course or an experience. I'm not talking about going into deep coding or anything like that. I'm talking about really being able to articulate what does a platform bring to your organization to improve that organization. And do it in such a way that it's meaningful, it's real and authentic, but it's backed up by more than just, I read the headlines. So if you read the headlines, you're not necessarily going to know enough, I don't think. And the concern I would have is when you go and justify the need for a particular technology or platform, you're going to have to convince somebody that you believe in it. And it's going to be very hard for you to believe in something that you just read in the headlines. And again, I really don't want to make it sound as if I kind of have done this perfectly throughout my career, because I haven't. I've made mistakes as well. But when we launched Cooper at AstraZeneca, I was on every single governance meeting throughout the course of 3 years, or 1 or 2. Because I wanted to be seen by the team who were working incredibly hard across KPMG as systems integrator, Cooper as the platform provider, and AstraZeneca. I wanted to be seen to be the person who was accountable for that program. Now, there were people on that governance team who were absolutely superb, who knew much more about Cooper and the wirings of Cooper than I did. And that was exactly what they were there to do. My job was to make sure that I was the ambassador for that project. Now, an ambassador doesn't mean you're just a figurehead. You should be able to question your team throughout the governance meetings. And we had some very, very kind of active team meetings throughout the course of those 3 years. And it was just because you were probing and you were asking questions which were relevant. You weren't asking questions which were redundant or obsolete. You were asking relevant questions.
Well, you're a great example of leadership and business-centric leadership and people-focused leadership. I can tell just kind of listening to your conversation that, this sounds like I'm schmoozing or something. That's not the intention, but having been a CPO and having struggled under different quality of managers and leaders and directors over time, it's always great to see someone that's kind of that really good example. I don't know what the future is bringing for you personally. And Zach, I'm going to squeeze in one final question, but from a leadership perspective, if you were looking back, I love to ask this question in these jam sessions, but I'm sure that this 40 years has taught you a lot. And if you could go in the time machine and go back to this, hey, this is the thing that really mattered most to me, like what would that be?
I think my first opportunity to be a CPO when I went to Diageo in 2006 was probably the pivotal point for me. And the reason I say that, I'd worked for a couple of really tremendous leaders at GSK and SmithKline Beecham. I moved from being somebody entering the organization as a strategic purchasing manager to being head of R&D procurement for GSK as a whole, and then took on their production procurement role at a strategic level. But I always had this hankering to be a CPO, and it was clear that opportunity wasn't necessarily going to come as quickly as I wanted to, and I was approached to become the first CPO at Diageo. So this was an opportunity to bring together procurement who were splintered at that point across finance, marketing, and manufacturing. And that was a huge opportunity for me to demonstrate my kind of history and career up to that point in terms of understanding across the breadth of procurement, because I'd done R&D, which you could class as predominantly indirects. I'd done production procurement, which was direct materials. So this was the first opportunity to sit in the CPO seat, mold an organization, build an identity and a brand for the function, but also talk about a value proposition that made sense to the business. And I tell you, the team at Diageo, from the start point that we had, just turned into a superb procurement unit. And I learned as much from my teams as I did try and kind of help them. So I think that was probably the turning point in my career where I actually thought, you know what, I can actually do this, rather than pretend that this was what I wanted to do.
Yep.
Dive into the deep end.
Yep. Have the confidence, for sure.
John, I want to thank you so much for your time. I think we can wrap it up there. This has been an amazing conversation full of practical advice. So I really hope our listeners can take away a lot from this. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Appreciate the time and appreciate the questions.